This is the disturbing non-human encounters iceberg. Tier 1. Self-made. Imagine you're a hotel receptionist working over Christmas, which means you're part receptionist, part therapist, and part miracle worker. Just when you think you might survive the chaos, one guest makes a habit of coming down to the lobby every night. He shows up, plants himself in front of your desk, and rambles on for hours while you nod along, because really, what other choice do you have? He says he's best friends with Princess Diana, the ex-wife of the current king of the UK. He explains that his job involves top-secret robotics projects and claims he's worked with technology 100 years ahead of what the rest of us are using. He says all of this with such complete confidence that you almost start buying it yourself, until you remember Princess Diana died in the 90s. At first, the receptionist assumes this is a mental health issue, which is a reasonable conclusion, considering everything the man had said leading up to this point. But as the nights go by and the conversations continue, something feels off in a different way. The man doesn't seem confused or scatterbrained. He's consistent, focused, and very sure of who he says he is. Then one night, he finally spells it out. He says he's not human and that he built himself. He explains that his reason for staying at the hotel and talking so much is because he needs to watch humans, listen to them, and learn how they act so he can fit in properly. He even tells the receptionist how someone could prove he's not human. According to him, the giveaway is his toes. He says he doesn't have toenails, and that's the one thing he could never get right. Then New Year's Eve rolls around. The man leaves his room barefoot, wearing only pajamas, and walks through the lobby like this is completely normal behavior. The receptionist finally gets a good look at his feet and realizes there really are no toenails at all. Aside from that, his skin is flawless. There are no spots, scars, freckles, or wrinkles, even though he looks old enough to be in his 70s. It's at that moment the receptionist, who went on to share the encounter on Reddit years later, realizes they might be in way over their head with forces they don't understand. If you're looking at the encounter from the receptionist's point of view, there's no denying that it sounds pretty creepy. But it also sounds a lot like the uncanny valley effect. That's the uncomfortable feeling people get when something looks almost human, but not quite. Robots, dolls, animated characters, and apparently, mysterious hotel guests can all trigger it. Your brain recognizes a person, but something feels slightly off, and that mismatch can be surprisingly unsettling. If you're looking at it from the self-made man side, though, a completely different explanation might fit. Some people have a rare mental disorder called Cotard's delusion, where they become convinced that they're dead, don't exist, or are missing parts of their body. If that was what was happening here, then the receptionist wasn't looking at something supernatural at all. But we'll never know for sure. Red-eyed pig. Imagine being 9 years old on Halloween night, stuck inside because your parents decided costumes are a waste of money, and the outside world is a death trap. That was Silverio's situation in 2004. No trick-or-treating, no candy, just the whole family parked indoors watching TV and pretending that was a perfectly acceptable substitute for childhood fun. At some point, Silverio got bored enough to look for something quieter to do. He decided to head over to his bedroom and grab his sketchpad. He left the living room, walked into his room, and relied on the moonlight coming in through the open window to see where he was going. As he reached for the light switch, something moved outside the window and caught his eye. He turned his head and locked eyes with a pig. Not a normal pig, obviously. The head pressed up against the window looked damaged in ways that didn't make sense. Its face looked beaten, the ears were gone, the mouth looked torn open, and one eye hung loose while the other stared back at him, bright red and focused. Silverio stopped moving, but the pig didn't. Its red eye stayed locked on him in a way that felt like it wanted him to know it could see him too. He couldn't scream, couldn't step back, and couldn't even look away. He just stood there, staring at it, while it stared back. The pig eventually disappeared, but the image didn't. Silverio carried it with him for years. Every now and then, he'd think back to that moment and wonder whether he'd actually seen something real or whether his brain had cooked it all up. As an adult, he started digging into reports of strange, non-human encounters, partly out of curiosity and partly because he wanted some kind of explanation for what he'd seen. That's how he found out that a boy from a completely different area had reported seeing the exact same beat-up, one-eyed pig. That discovery didn't make him feel better. If anything, it made things worse, because now he couldn't write it off as his 9-year-old brain playing tricks on him. If you go digging through folklore, pigs don't have the best reputation. One of the most famous examples comes from the Bible, where Jesus cast a demon out of a man and into a herd of pigs. and plenty of other folk traditions link pigs to evil spirits and bad omens. Then there's the red eye, which in folklore is usually the universe's way of telling you that whatever you're looking at probably isn't friendly. No matter how you look at it, a red-eyed pig definitely spells danger. Alien abduction. Ever had one of those moments where reality suddenly feels like a bad sci-fi movie? That's pretty much the premise of this encounter that was posted 8 years ago by a Redditor called PM Me Your Ghost Pic. Back in 2001, when he was 13, a friend asked him to help her grandparents set up their computer. So he rode his bike over, figuring he'd get in, sort it out, and be home before the weather turned. When he arrived, the old couple sat on the couch while he worked through the setup, nodding along like they understood more than they did. Their granddaughter, somewhere between 4 and 6 years old, was asleep in the next room. The whole thing was shaping up to be the most forgettable evening of his life. He just started packing up his bag when a cold breeze moved through the room, which would have been unremarkable, except every door and window in the house was shut. He let it go until he noticed both grandparents staring toward the kitchen, completely still, like something in there had locked them in place. He followed their eyes, and standing in the kitchen were 3 creatures. 2 of them were short and gray with oversized eyes, dressed in silver jumpsuits. The third was taller and roughly human-shaped, except for a head that looked like a praying mantis, and it was wearing a black robe with a yellow stripe running down the middle. The 3 of them moved into the next room, and when they came back, the tall one was carrying the little girl who was still sound asleep. The boy knew he couldn't just stand there and watch the child get taken by whatever these things were, so he went at them. For a second, he thought he might actually be able to do something, but the grandfather stopped him. The old man told him that they, as in the 3 strange creatures in the middle of kidnapping his daughter, would bring her back. The creatures stood there the entire time. They stared at the boy for what felt like forever, and then a light formed around them. When it faded, they were gone, and the room went dead silent, and stayed silent for a long minute. Then the grandfather repeated that the girl would be returned, and that was it. The boy was not about to hang around for the sequel, so he grabbed his bike and pedaled home as fast as his legs could carry him, checking the sky every few seconds, because part of him fully expected to spot a ship hiding somewhere in the clouds. He didn't see anything, but the memory kept him awake all night. The next day, he told his friend everything, expecting her to look at him like he'd completely lost it. But she wasn't surprised. She said that her family had dealt with the same beings before. They had tried to stop them, couldn't, and eventually just learned to trust that the children would always come back. As strange as that sounds, the little girl really did show up again a few hours later, like nothing had happened. Not long after that, the family packed up and moved away. Stories like this are one reason alien abduction reports have stuck around for so long. For decades, people all over the world have claimed they were taken by strange beings, only to return later with missing time, unusual memories, or stories that sound impossible to verify. Scientists have proposed several explanations. Some researchers point to sleep paralysis, while others believe certain cases may be linked to mental health conditions or false memories. At the same time, many people remain convinced their experiences were real. And whether those experiences involved aliens, something psychological, or something else entirely depends on who you ask. Riverfront Encounter. A man who goes by the name Bill and Jennifer 717 on Reddit and his girlfriend were on their way home from a trip when they decided to take a detour and stop by the riverfront. They parked the car and stayed inside, just watching the water and enjoying the quiet. After a few minutes, a black woman on a bicycle rode up to their car and stopped to speak with the man. She was smoking a cigarette and asking for some change, saying she had an important appointment to get to. The man thought the request was a bit weird because she didn't look the part, but he opened his small change box and emptied it into her hand right away. She smiled, leaned toward her window, and said that God would bless them greatly. During that short encounter, the man noticed something strange. Even though he'd clearly seen her smoking, the woman didn't smell like cigarettes at all. Instead, she smelled sweet, and her eyes were the bluest he had ever seen. After thanking them, she got on her bike and rode off. A few years later, the couple got married. Then, they were hit with bad news. Doctors told them the wife might never be able to have children. For a while, that looked like their reality. Then, against the odds, she became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl. Shortly after their daughter was born, the husband was eating in a cafeteria when an older woman and man walked past him. The woman stopped in her tracks and looked straight at him. The second he saw those piercing blue eyes, he recognized her from the riverfront years earlier. She patted his head, said, "I told you God would bless you," and then kept walking. like she hadn't just casually reopened one of the strangest memories of his life. Bill and Jennifer 717 never figured out what happened by that river, and the woman's identity still remains a mystery. He shared the story on Reddit 6 years later, and it ended up reaching thousands of people. Plenty of theories came in, but none of them stuck. Was the woman an angel taking a break from celestial business to hand out blessings in exchange for loose change? A spirit doing a quick lap around the earth to see who's worth rewarding? Or something else entirely? If she was an angel, the man who shared this encounter wouldn't be the first to run into one without knowing it. The Bible is full of stories where people host an angel for a while before they clock what they're actually dealing with. The Catholic Church has its own version of this too, where people report seeing the Virgin Mary. Sometimes it's just one person. Other times, a whole crowd sees her at once. They call it a Marian apparition. Tier 2. Brick wall. You know that moment where you sit down with someone, and about 3 minutes in, your brain quietly goes, yeah, this was a mistake. That's pretty much how things went when a man in his early 20s unexpectedly ran into an old childhood friend he hadn't seen in years. The story was shared on Reddit 2 years ago by the man's wife, using the account Dreamlean. According to her, this old friend had always been a little strange growing up. Nothing extreme, just weird enough that people noticed. The kind of person you couldn't quite explain, but you also didn't feel great being alone with. Still, years had passed, and running into him again felt harmless enough. The two started catching up and talking like old friends do. They went over old school memories and the usual who's doing what now stuff. Then, out of nowhere, the guy locked eyes with him and just kept staring. It was awkward, sure, but not enough reason to bail on the conversation just yet. So Dreamlean's husband let it slide. Then it got worse. He started feeling tense out of nowhere, like someone was standing way too close to him. Except no one was. The longer it went on, the more it felt like his friend was somehow poking around inside his head, trying to see what he could find. At that point, the husband knew he had to do something, even though he had no clue what. So he fell back on the one bit of training most people have from watching way too many horror movies. He pictured a brick wall and just held it there. A few seconds passed, then his friend said, "Stop." And that was all he said. He didn't offer any explanation or even acknowledge that anything strange had just happened. Instead, the staring eased up, and he went right back to the conversation, like nothing had changed. The husband stayed long enough for the meetup to end naturally. But by then, he already knew whatever they had between them was finished. After that day, he kept his distance. The friend in this encounter might have been what people call a psychic vampire. They don't go for blood like the ones in the movies. They feed on energy instead, draining the life force out of whoever's around them to top themselves back up. And the victim walks away from every meeting feeling run out and exhausted, without ever knowing why. Another mummy. Imagine being 6 years old and realizing you might be the only person in the room seeing something absolutely horrifying. That was Alyssa's reality. According to a story her boyfriend later shared on Reddit under the username Creative Pool. When Alyssa was little, her mom and grandma often brought her along to visit her uncle's house. And every single time she walked into his room, she saw what looked like a literal mummy lying in his bed. It looked like an adult woman wrapped head to toe in bandages, with all kinds of strange things piled over her, like someone had gone full ancient Egypt and set up camp right there in the bedroom. Alyssa did what any 6-year-old would do after finding a creepy bedroom mummy. She ran straight to her mom and grandma and told them exactly what she'd seen. Then she dragged them down to hall to prove it, pointing at the bed and fully expecting the screaming to start at any second. But it never did, because every time the adults looked in, they saw exactly what you'd hope to see in a bedroom. Absolutely nothing. Eventually, she decided she needed better evidence. So one day, after her mom and grandma did their usual check of the room and headed out, she stayed behind. She sat by the door, kept her eyes locked on the bed, and waited for the strange creature to do something. After a while, it did. The mummy sat straight up, turned toward her, climbed out of bed, and started walking her way. She was out of that room before it could take a second step. So much for gathering evidence. At the time, she blamed her uncle. He liked messing with people, liked getting reactions, and staging a fake mummy to scare a 6-year-old sounded exactly like the kind of joke he might commit to. More importantly, that explanation let her sleep at night, so she stuck with it and didn't ask too many questions. Years later, that explanation started falling apart. Alyssa and a friend got roped into dog sitting for her uncle while he was out of town, and they ended up sleeping in his room, the same one where the mummy used to hang out. It had been redecorated, the furniture was different, and there wasn't a bandage or an ancient curse in sight. Still, neither of them could shake the feeling that something in there wasn't right. Alyssa told her friend what she used to see, and that was all it took. Neither of them slept much that night, though as far as we know, nothing happened, which leaves the obvious question of what she was actually seeing as a kid. There's a belief that children pick up on this kind of thing more than the adults around them do. They're forever claiming to see ghosts and figures that no grown-up in the room can make out. So maybe Alyssa was just one more kid on that list. Woman on the tree. You're 5 years old at your grandmother's birthday party in Houston, and because the adults have claimed the living room for grown-up conversation, you and the other kids have been turned loose in the backyard to burn off energy. You're running around doing kid stuff when one of you spots a bird sitting in a tree, staring down at the group. It looks normal enough at first, except it doesn't stay that way, because the bird starts changing shape, and what's sitting in the branches now is a full-grown woman. The encounter was posted on Reddit about 8 years ago by an account called Eva M15. After spotting the woman, the kids do exactly what you'd expect and bolt for their parents. But before the adults can make it outside, she shifts back into a bird and just sits there like nothing happened. By the time the grown-ups step out to see what all the screaming is about, they're looking at a perfectly ordinary bird in a tree. It just sits there watching everyone until the grandmother herself walks outside, and then it finally flies off. Now, this would be unsettling enough on its own, but the house already had history. Over the years, guests had reported seeing a woman in white drifting between rooms, and family members kept finding things buried in the garden that had no business being there. Animal bones, guts, melted candles, and other items that looked like leftovers from somebody's ritual. So a shape-shifting bird woman perched in the backyard wasn't even the strangest thing that the property had produced. When the story hit Reddit, the most popular theory was that this was a skinwalker. In Navajo tradition, a skinwalker is a witch who gains the ability to shapeshift into animals by committing an act so terrible it cuts them off from their community, usually the killing of a close family member. They're called skinwalkers because they wear the skins of the animals they transform into. And for that reason, wearing the pelt of any predatory animal is considered taboo in Navajo culture. Stranger at the park. You're 9 years old, spending the afternoon at your aunt's place, and you've wandered to the local park to kick a ball around with your cousin. You're going back and forth until one pass rolls too close to the road. You jog over to grab it, and that's when you notice the car that's been parked there a little too long. As you pick up the ball, a man steps out of the back seat. He's huge and on the older side, with long, straight blonde hair and blue eyes that are hard to look away from. Something about him feels off, though not in the way that makes you run. So the two of you just stand there for a few seconds. Then he says, "You don't know who I am, but I know who you are," and calls you by your full government name, which is not a thing a stranger should be able to do. The smart move would have been to bolt for the nearest adult and never come back. But you stay put. Before anything else can happen, two women step out of the car. They look almost identical, younger than the man, with the same blonde hair. Without a word to you, they take him by the arm and steer him back toward the car. Then it pulls away, leaving you standing there with no clue what you just witnessed. Years later, he shared his experience on Reddit with a username Beard Closet, and the comments filled up fast with people offering the same explanation. The most popular theory was that he'd crossed paths with what ufology calls Nordic aliens. They're also called tall whites, and believers claim they come from the Pleiades star cluster. The descriptions are weirdly specific too. 6 to 7 feet tall, long blonde hair, blue eyes, and skin so pale that some people swear it looked blue-gray, or even slightly purple under the light. According to believers, they almost look completely human, and tend to give off this calm, watchful, oddly parental energy. And because alien stories can never stay simple, telepathy usually gets thrown in there too. Beard Closet said he'd never even heard of Nordic aliens before posting his story, but after enough people kept bringing them up, he finally looked them up himself. He found photos and artist sketches, stared at them for a while, and then said they looked exactly like what he saw that day in the park. Tier 3. Floating Woman. If you ever wake up in the middle of the night and think, "Hey, maybe I'll watch TV downstairs instead of staying in bed," maybe think again, because that's exactly what this guy did. and it didn't go well. He and his wife had just moved into a new townhouse and were still figuring out the layout, the neighbors, and how not to become the neighborhood weirdos. He didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, and he especially didn't believe in things floating through his backyard at 3 in the morning. But that was about to change. Somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m., he went downstairs and sat in his recliner facing the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The TV cast light, enough to see outside if something moved, but not enough to explain away what would happen next. After about an hour of mindless channel surfing, he noticed movement. A woman was gliding across the yard. Her feet never touched the ground, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, completely ignoring the house and him. He froze and sat straighter in the chair than he had in years. His brain shouted at him to get up, check the door, do something. But some part of him knew moving would only make it worse. So he stayed exactly where he was and watched until she drifted out of sight. It was dark, so he couldn't catch every detail, but he got a few things. She was slim, her hair was long, and her clothes were light and sort of flowing. She didn't glow, and she wasn't see-through, so she didn't match any ghost description he'd ever heard. She just was. The next morning, he told his wife, who laughed at first because she figured he was messing with her, but he wasn't. Once he explained that he'd been wide awake and watching TV for a solid hour before the woman showed up, she stopped laughing and started taking it seriously. They tried to make sense of the encounter, to figure out what exactly the woman was, but nothing fit. They thought about asking the neighbors if anyone else had seen her, but walking up to a stranger and asking, "Hey, did you happen to catch a floating woman around 4 a.m.?" felt like a fast way to get tagged as the neighborhood crazies. So they dropped that idea, kept the whole thing to themselves, and quietly hoped their new house wasn't haunted. If you go off the man's description, the easy guess is that the mysterious woman was a lady in white, a ghost figure that shows up in folklore all over the world. She's usually seen in a long, white flowing gown, and she's almost always tied to some kind of tragedy. Most stories say she died in an accident, or was murdered, or got betrayed by a lover, or just wasted away from a love that never came back to her. 3 beings. It was October 2016, late at night, and a college student with the Reddit username Distrite7 was home alone with her dad in their ranch house out in the middle of nowhere. Her dad had gone to bed around 10, while she stayed up watching TV until 11:30, before finally calling it a night and heading to her room. Sometime after midnight, she got thirsty and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. And if you've seen enough horror movies, you can probably already guess this is where things started going very wrong. The second she stepped into the hall, something felt off. The house was way too quiet. All the crickets and cicadas that usually went off outside her window had gone completely silent, and the only thing she could hear was the faint hum of her dad's white noise machine down the hall. It was weird, but she told herself it was probably nothing and kept walking. Then she reached the kitchen, pulled back the curtain, and immediately stopped in her tracks. Right in front of her was a figure with dark gray skin, almost the color of gunmetal. Its body kept shifting against the darkness around it, like parts of it couldn't stay in full view. While she stood there trying to make sense of what she was looking at, the figure slowly turned its head and locked eyes with her. Her hand froze on the curtain. Her mouth fell open, and before she could move a single muscle, everything went black. When she opened her eyes, she was somehow back in her bed with the covers neatly tucked in, which of course raises the obvious question of who exactly tucked her in. She didn't have time to dwell on it though, because over at the far side of the room, 3 tall gray figures were standing over her with their heads nearly touching the ceiling. Her body froze all over again, and even though she desperately wanted to scream, she couldn't. The creatures looked at her for what felt like forever, and then the one in the middle leaned forward and tapped her foot 3 times. Each tap sent this weird crawling sensation through her whole body, and then everything went black again. She came to a couple of minutes later, still lying on top of the bed and crying harder than she had in years. Once she pulled herself together enough to check the clock, it read 1:33 a.m. Sleep was obviously off the table at that point, so she spent the rest of the night replaying what had just happened and seriously wondering if she'd finally lost her mind. When Distrite7 shared the story online, one Redditor said it sounded like a textbook close encounter of the third kind, which is the official ufology term for seeing a UFO and coming face to face with whatever's inside it. They pointed her toward popular ufologists Bud Hopkins and Whitley Strieber, who'd spent decades writing about people who claimed they went through the exact same thing. then suggested that she go outside one night, stare up at the stars, and mentally tell whatever was out there to leave her alone. The less alien explanation for all of this happening is something called false awakening. It's when the brain convinces you that you've woken up and gotten on with your night when your body hasn't moved an inch off the mattress, and you don't realize any of it was a dream until you actually open your eyes. Poor sleep or a brief misfire in the brain tends to trigger it, and it can loop, so you keep waking up again and again while you're really still out cold. Weird dog. A group of friends were messing around in an old, empty country house one night when they ran into something that made them wish they'd stayed home instead. They were moving through the place room by room, upstairs and downstairs, just checking it out for the sake of it, when one of them, the same person who later posted the story on Reddit under the username Elsric, noticed a door nobody had gotten around to opening yet. He walked over, grabbed the handle, and felt a chill crawl up his spine before the door even moved. Still, against his better judgment, he eased it open. Inside, he saw a dim red light, though he couldn't tell where exactly it was coming from. As the door opened wider, a deep growl rolled through the room. Near the ceiling, he saw the top half of a dog-like creature about the size of a German shepherd. Its teeth pushed past its lips, long and sharp, and it stood there like it was seconds away from tearing him apart. Its eyes glowed red, and under normal circumstances, that would have been the main problem. But not in this case. The walls looked like they'd been painted in blood. The floor was covered in fur, flesh, and organs, and the smell was so bad it felt like it stuck to the air itself. That was the breaking point. Elsric slammed the door shut and ran out of the house like his life depended on it. Which, to be fair, it kinda did. Anyone with even a shred of self-preservation would have taken that as their cue to stay far away from that room forever. But not our guy. The next afternoon, he came back with a kitchen knife, like that was going to even the odds, and opened the door again. This time, the room was bright enough to properly see inside, and somehow the feeling of dread from the night before was gone. The room was a perfect square with no windows. Blood, fur, and flesh coated the walls and floor, and 3 cut-up dog corpses lay scattered inside. This time around, one look was all it took for the guy to see he'd pushed his luck about as far as it would go. He turned around, walked straight back out, and that was the last time he ever went anywhere near that house. When the story started gaining traction on Reddit, one commenter offered a more practical explanation. They said the narrator might have walked into a dogfighting setup, since abandoned houses are apparently used for that kind of thing more often than people would like to admit. For the most part, it's not a bad guess. The problem is it doesn't really explain the part about a German shepherd with red eyes. Monitoring spirit. Imagine living a house where the footsteps never stop, but whatever's making them never actually comes into your room. That was what life was like for Redditor Donuts Are a Girl's BFF and her family growing up. At least, according to the story she shared 8 years ago. For years, they figured they just had a streak of bad luck with houses, but the actual answer turned out to be a lot worse. The trouble started back when her older sister and brother were kids, living with their mom in a house with one long hallway running through it. Almost every night, the two of them would lie in bed and listen to footsteps pacing up and down that hallway. It sounded like someone was walking back and forth in the dark, but they never saw anyone. The kids eventually got so used to the sounds that they gave whatever was making them a name. Mr. Stompy. At night, they'd lie in bed listening as he walked through the house, sometimes stopping right outside their door for a moment before carrying on. Now, it wasn't just the kids hearing these sounds. Anyone who spent the night picked up on the footsteps too, and a few people even heard them moving across the roof. At least one relative got rattled enough to swear off the place entirely. For the most part, Mr. Stompy kept a respectful distance from everyone in the house, with one exception, the mom. One night, she was lying awake when the footsteps came into her room and walked straight up to her bed. She held still and played dead, hoping it would lose interest, until she felt the mattress dip under a weight beside her. Then she felt breath moving through her hair. She shot up and the room was empty. Eventually, the family chalked the whole thing up to a bad house and moved out, which is right around when it became obvious the house was never the issue. The activity just followed them wherever they went. After a while, they stopped fighting it and just lived with it. No one was getting hurt, so they figured there wasn't much else to do except their resident ghost as part of the household. Things only really came together years down the line, after the mom moved in with the older sister, who by then had a husband and kids of her own. The activity showed up right on cue. The sister kept catching shadows drifting through the house and into her kid's room. She'd get up thinking it was her husband or her mom checking on them, only to find no one there. Eventually, the sister moved to a new place without the mom, and all the strange activities stopped overnight. That was the moment everything finally clicked. The houses were never haunted. Their mom was. Once the story hit Reddit, a lot of commenters decided that the entity was probably the mom's late husband. And the narrator casually added one detail that made everyone go, yeah, that tracks. The first house, where Mr. Stompy began his nightly patrols, was the same house where the mom had lived with her husband before he died of a drug overdose. Whatever it was, it lines up pretty closely with what people call the poltergeist phenomenon. A poltergeist is the kind of spirit that announces itself through noise and physical disturbance. The footsteps, the knocking, objects moving, that sort of thing. And unlike a normal haunting, it doesn't attach to a house. It attaches to a person, which would explain why Mr. Stompy kept showing up no matter how many times the family moved. Tier 4. Father-in-law. What would you do if someone who's supposed to be dead turned up right in front of you? That's the question at the center of the story that was posted on Reddit about 8 years ago by an account called 7devils777. She was engaged to a man whose father had died back when he was a kid. The father was an electrician who got electrocuted on the job and fell from a height with a yellow and red striped shirt on. The fiancé had only been a child when it happened, but he'd held on to plenty of good memories of his dad, the kind that live in old photos and family stories. The woman had seen the photos for herself, and that's how she knew there was a strong resemblance between the father and son. One weekend, the couple went to stay at the man's grandmother's 3-story farmhouse, the same house his late father had grown up in. They picked a room on the 3rd floor for the view, even though getting up there meant climbing a creepy, half-finished stairway that looked like it belonged in the haunted house. On the night of the encounter, the woman went down to the kitchen for milk. On her way back up, she paused on the 2nd floor. The bathroom light was on, but the bedroom across the hall was completely dark, and that's when she saw him. Her fiancé's father was standing in the doorway, wearing the exact same shirt he died in. He was standing completely still and staring right at her. That's one way to make an appearance. For a moment, the woman froze. Then she turned and headed to the 3rd floor, telling herself the light and her imagination were playing tricks on her. But that wasn't the case. While heading upstairs, she passed 2 other bedrooms with the lights off, and in each doorway she saw him standing there. Eventually, she made it to her own bedroom and shut the door behind her. According to her, she wasn't exactly scared, at least not in the pee your pants type of way. She just couldn't make sense of what she had seen. She tried to wake her fiancé to tell him, but the man could sleep through an earthquake, so that went nowhere. In the end, she gave up and spent the rest of the night replaying the encounter in her head, trying to make sense of it. What she saw is what people call a ghost apparition, which is just the term for a ghost showing up, either looking the way it did in life or in some other form. In her case, it was the first kind, right down to the shirt he died in. Reptile Creature. You're wandering through the Arizona desert in the middle of the night with a sword in your hand, feeling pretty confident that you're the only one out there. Then, something happens that quickly proves otherwise. That's how an encounter shared on Reddit 8 years ago by a user named Fayako began. At the time, they were living in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and had been homeless for about 6 months. In that time, they'd fallen into a strange routine. The desert got cold at night, so they stayed moving to keep warm. Then, once the sun came up and started heating things up, they'd catch a few hours of sleep, wake around midday, and grab another quick nap around dinner, and do it all again. During the day, they went into town unarmed to pick up whatever food they could find. At night, they carried a straight-edged sword they'd bought before life went sideways, and headed as far from town as possible. By the time of this encounter, this routine had become their new normal. One night, the person had been walking for a while when they heard a thumping sound up ahead. The area was thick with bushes, so they couldn't see what was making it. Not wanting to walk into danger, or come face to face with a bear, they grabbed a stick and hit a nearby tree a few times. The thumping stopped immediately. But then a head popped out from behind a bush, like an animal caught off guard. Its face was confusing. Part primate, part something reptilian. The person drew their sword and pointed it forward, but the strap holding the sheath on their back snapped, so they ended up pulling the sword while it was still in the sheath. As they aimed at the creature, it rose onto all fours, revealing its full height, which was about 4 feet. then bolted into the darkness. And that was it. The creature never showed up again. The people who read this encounter when it was posted online figured the narrator had run into a lizard man. And he wasn't the first. In 2014, a group of friends out biking in the desert ran into a creature that fit the same description. Sightings like this go back generations, and nobody's ever been able to explain what these things actually are or where they came from. Heart-shaped head. A Redditor named Miranda Mandarin shared a story from when she was 7 years old. It was a regular afternoon, and she was in her bedroom playing with her friend Celia while the parents hung out at the front of the house. Everything about the day was completely normal, which is usually how these stories start. The two of them were doing whatever 7-year-olds do, and at some point, Miranda glanced over toward the window. That's when she realized something was standing on the other side of the glass, looking back at her. From the neck down, it looked like a normal person in a blazer, just minding their own business. Though doing that outside a kid's window is kind of creepy. But from the neck up, that's where things really went sideways. The head was shaped like a heart, but not in the cute Valentine's card way. The skin was brown and leathery, almost like animal hide, and the thing didn't have a face at all. Somehow, even without a face, Miranda could still see thick blue and black veins bulging beneath the creature's skin. She stared for a moment, trying to figure out what exactly she was seeing. Then she looked over at Celia. At that moment, Celia looked right back at her with wide eyes and her mouth hanging open. Neither of them said a word, but they both knew the other had seen it too. That's when the fear really set in. Miranda wanted to run. She wanted to leave the room, but her legs just wouldn't cooperate, so she stayed frozen, staring out the window, barely breathing. And then, without any sound or movement, the thing was just gone. After a long, awkward pause, the two girls got up, walked to the front of the house, and stayed with their parents. They didn't talk about what they had seen. Neither of them mentioned it to the other, and they never told their parents. Years later, when Miranda finally typed the whole thing out and posted it online, someone in the comments proposed a theory that actually held up pretty well. They figured the thing she saw might have been one of the so-called tall grays, supposedly the management layer of the alien world. The ones calling the shots, while the smaller, more familiar grays do the legwork. The tall grays usually turn up in abduction accounts, along with the conspiracy theories about secret deals between aliens and various governments. There's even one theory going around that they're a future version of humanity, or something close to it, looping back to visit their own ancestors after cracking time travel. The other possibility is that the girls caught a window watcher in the act. In folklore, window watchers are exactly what they sound like. Strange-looking creatures that turn up at people's windows at night to stand there and watch them. Which is more or less what Miranda described. Sphere Man. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something was wrong before anything actually happened? That's what this guy described. And it turned out he was right in the worst possible way. He posted the story on Reddit about 8 years ago under the username Random Studman. He lived in Vancouver, Washington, on a quiet dead-end street called Orchard Del Court. And one morning, around 8 a.m., he headed out for school like he always did. The walk was barely a block, straight to where the street met St. James Road. And it was the same route he took every single day at around the same time. That morning felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. As he reached the end of the street, he lifted his head and saw something across the road. At first, it registered as a person. Then he did a double take. The creature standing in front of him had the rough shape of a man. Arms, legs, a torso, even a head. But every part of it was made up of black spheres about a foot wide. Each one had a strange texture. No matter how hard he tried, his brain couldn't come up with anything familiar to compare it to. The thing moved like it owned the place. It danced around a street pole, and the longer he watched, the more uncomfortable he felt. There was something aggressive about it, like the movement was playful on the surface but angry underneath. When the figure noticed him, the dancing stopped. It turned, looked straight at him, and vanished instantly. Shaken but unsure what else to do, the guy kept walking to school and tried to pretend his brain hadn't just short-circuited. The rest of the day went by normally. Then that night, the news broke. A group of kids had been racing cars in the area. There was an accident, and 5 or 6 people had died. When the guy heard about it and went out to see where it happened, his stomach dropped. The accident occurred at the exact spot where the creature had been that morning. From that point on, he couldn't shake the feeling that what he saw that morning was somehow connected to the tragedy. In his mind, the Sphere Man only showed up because something terrible was coming. Tier 5. A meet and greet with the devil. Over a decade ago, a girl from New Orleans was working as a bartender on Bourbon Street. She had seen her fair share of strange people, thanks to the nature of her job, but none of them came close to this one man. At the time, she was dating a saxophonist who played in a local band, and she often went to his gigs. One night after a show, they were walking back to their car a few blocks away. They were talking and laughing when the girl noticed an older white man trailing them. He was well-dressed and had a calm, pleasant voice when he greeted them. He asked if they were locals. They said yes, and the three of them started walking together. That's when she looked into his eyes and froze. They were gold, literally glowing, like fire behind human skin. The trio kept going, and they were together for 3 blocks before the man turned down a side street and disappeared. The encounter alone would have been strange enough, but it didn't end there. As the couple continued toward their vehicle, the girl noticed a parked car with the numbers 666 on the license plate. She shrugged it off, but the next car read saved. She thought it was weird, but didn't say anything to her boyfriend. When they reached their car, there was 666 again. That's when she mentioned it, and her boyfriend admitted he had noticed it too. He also commented on the man's eyes. While they were standing there trying to figure out what just happened, they saw him again approaching from the opposite direction. The man looked straight at them, his golden eyes glowing, and waved. Then he said, "Funny, we were all meant to be in the same spot at the same time." Feeling more than a little uneasy, the couple didn't bother to respond. They just waved back, got in their car, and drove off as quickly as possible. Years later, when the girl shared the story online, one reader suggested the man might have been Elwa, an entity from the voodoo religion that can appear human and either bless or curse people depending on the circumstances. Sebastian, you're on your way back from work on a random evening when you get the urge to pee. You duck into a quiet alley, thinking it'll be quick, and from there, the evening spirals out of control. That's how this story, shared on Reddit 4 years ago by a user named DMW Toxic, real name Castro, begins. He had just gotten off work in New York City and was walking to the train when nature called. While he was handling business in what was supposed to be an empty alley, a polite British voice behind him said, "Good evening." Castro looked up to see a man in his late 20s or early 30s, pale as linen, with dark hair, blue eyes, and an all-black outfit that probably cost more than what Castro made in a month. He thought about asking why a perfectly dressed man was hanging around a dark alley at night greeting strangers, but he decided against it. The man introduced himself as Sebastian. Castro said his name back, and that was the end of it. He left the alley wondering whether he'd just bumped into a quirky rich weirdo or crossed paths with a serial killer. The next night, even though he wasn't working, Castro went to a bar near his office. As he stepped off the train, a familiar voice called his name, and there was Sebastian, in yesterday's clothes. They headed inside together. Sebastian said he didn't drink, but would keep him company. And at some point in the conversation, he casually let it slip that he was a vampire. Castro laughed it off, thinking he'd heard wrong, although Sebastian didn't laugh with him. Instead, he placed a cold hand over Castro's, told him to relax, and said he wasn't there to hurt anyone. Then he calmly said that he was 600 years old, one of the only vampires still around, and that he'd been curious about Castro since the alley. Castro now had 2 options, and neither was great. Either he was having drinks with an actual vampire, or he was hanging out with someone who belonged in a psych ward. Since there was no way to know for sure, he did the only sensible thing left, which was finish his drink, say his goodbyes, and head for the door. Sebastian walked him out, said he'd hoped they'd cross paths again, and let him go. They didn't. Castro's experience sounds like a deleted scene from Interview with a Vampire, but he swears it actually happened, and the part that haunted him most came after. Within days of Sebastian walking out of his life, everything collapsed. The arrest, the weekend in a cell, the lost job, the lost apartment, then his dad getting sick. In a lot of vampire folklore, that aftermath is the real tell. The classic vampires take more than blood. It drains the luck and vitality out of whoever it fixes on, and their life quietly falls apart in the weeks that follow. The grounded version is that Castro crossed paths with someone deep in the real-world vampire subculture, people who live and dress the part for real, and that his run of bad luck was just cruel timing. Either way, he packed up and moved back to Texas, convinced he'd brushed against something that wasn't quite human. Mother's last meal. Have you ever had a moment where your body suddenly betrays you, and you have no idea why? That's what happened to this girl one evening. She went out to dinner with her best friend and her boyfriend. Everything seemed normal until she suddenly couldn't breathe properly. Her heart was racing, and she was sweating like she'd run a marathon in a sauna. Her friends panicked and rushed her to the hospital. Doctors ran tests but couldn't find anything wrong. After about an hour and a half, the symptoms vanished just as suddenly as they had started. She was fine now, or at least that's what she thought. 2 days later, she learned that her mother had died. Her mother lived alone, and no one had heard from her for a few days. At first, the family assumed she was busy, but when she didn't show up for their New Year's Eve gathering, they started to worry. A relative went to check on her and found her dead at home. She had choked on her dinner. The coroner determined she had been dead for about 2 days, likely sometime between 7 p.m. and 11 p.m. When she heard this, the girl realized that her own sudden illness had occurred during the same window. Whatever she had felt, the racing heart, the shortness of breath, and even the sweating, mirrored exactly what her mother must have gone through in her final moments. Was it a coincidence? Or had this girl somehow felt her mother's pain from miles away? There's no way to know what really happened that day, but whatever it was, it stayed with her long after. Turns out, there's a name for feeling someone die across the country. They call it a crisis apparition, and unsettlingly, she's far from the only person who says it's happened to them. I've been waiting for you. The deputy chef of a small rural town was called to a traffic accident around 1:30 a.m. A car had overturned into a canal. Minutes later, he arrived at the scene alongside the California Highway Patrol, and they immediately began searching for survivors. The car was upside down in the empty canal, but there was no one inside. No driver and no passenger. At first, the officers assumed the driver had fled, but there was one tiny problem. The canal floor was muddy, yet there were no footprints leading away from the car. To make sure no one had been thrown from the vehicle before it landed in the canal, the officials combed the surrounding area, but they didn't find anything. After a while, the deputy called in the CHP officers and asked if there was any chance the driver could be trapped under the car. In response, an officer shone his flashlight under the vehicle. That's when they saw it. A pair of perfectly clean shoes poking out of the mud. The man's body was partially buried, but the shoes looked as good as new. If it weren't for them, no one would have found him. The deputy learned the man's identity and had to inform the family. He tracked down an old address and drove there. Around 3:30 a.m., he arrived at a trailer park. The trailers were numbered, so he started looking for clues. Then he spotted a car with temporary plates next to one trailer. As he approached, he heard a voice in the dark saying, "I've been waiting for you." The deputy turned to see an elderly Hispanic woman sitting in a rocking chair. Her face was calm as he approached, and he offered his condolences, still wondering how she had known he was coming. The woman explained that she knew her son had died about 2 hours earlier in an accident. When the deputy mentioned his name, she just nodded. He asked if anyone else had been in the car. She said he had been alone, coming from a party and had drunk too much. Confused, the deputy asked how she knew all this. She told him that at 1:30, her son had appeared to her in a dream. He had said his final goodbyes, apologized for everything, and even mentioned that a deputy would be coming to inform her. So she got up and waited outside. The deputy was too stunned to respond, so he simply muttered his condolences and left. The dream the woman had is called a visitation dream. It's a very vivid dream where someone who has died shows up to say goodbye, sometimes right after death, and sometimes years later. It happens more often than you'd think, and a lot of people say they've had the same kind of experience. That's the end of today's Iceberg. Whether you take these stories as fact, fiction, or somewhere in between, they remind us that the world might be stranger than we give it credit for. That's all for today. If you enjoyed peering into the weird and unsettling, don't forget to like and subscribe.